Good morning, everybody. We have a small group today, but a powerful one, I can tell. So I appreciate you coming this morning. Norm Shade is here from ACI Services and has put together a program talking about the role of natural gas in the North American energy equation. And so Norm has been with us before, a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, and had a great presentation then. So I'm just going to turn it right over to Norm, and we'll have a great presentation, I'm sure. Thank you.
Well, hopefully.
Yep.
Yeah, I was here, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years ago, and the room was full, so I don't know what that tells you. Actually, I think what it was is, the area had been through quite a boom, and then suddenly it fell off the cliff, and everybody was curious what the hell's going on. So what I'm going to tell you today is that, we're kind of crawling out of that trough and in a bit of a recovery mode that looks very encouraging that it's going to sustain itself for a good while. So this established a perspective. Wake everybody up here. A man was walking down the street when he was accosted by a particularly dirty and shabby looking homeless man who asked him for a couple of dollars for dinner. The man took out his wallet, extracted $10 and asked, "If I give you this money, will you buy some beer with it instead of dinner?" Sorry. I had this all set up and I blew it. I was supposed to say, "No, I had to stop drinking years ago," the homeless man replied. "Okay, well, will you spend it on green fees as a golf course instead of food?" the man asked. And the homeless man said, "Are you nuts? I haven't played golf in 20 years. "Well," said the man, "I'm not going to give you money. Instead, I'm going to take you home for a hot shower and a terrific dinner cooked by my wife." The homeless man was astounded. "Won't your wife be furious with you for doing that?" The man replied, "That's okay. It's important for her to see what a man looks like after he's given up drinking and golf." So how would we look if we gave up natural gas? It's kind of the lead into what I want to talk about today and try to present some facts to hopefully change perspectives, perceptions. Agenda, I want to kind of recap the shale revolution. We've had a decade of U.S. natural gas and oil resurgence. Talk about reserves and production, the environmental record, the economic record, the critical pathways to market, that is the pipeline system that carries gas to market. Comparison with other energy sources. Talk a little bit about the growing opposition to fossil fuels that's quite serious in the industry. And then what I say, drilling down into the future. What's the long range look like? And then a summary. So this is a picture of the conventional gas and oil plays in the U.S., in the lower 48 states, prior to the shale plays. And until 2006, the outlook wasn't all that great. Oil was pretty well declining, natural gas was declining. We were importing most of our oil. We were importing LNG. Companies were building big terminals to import LNG from foreign countries. Underground caverns were being built down in Louisiana to store that gas when it came off these big tankers, and then it would feed the pipelines. So that was the outlook in the first half of the 2000s. This kind of shows the picture from 1970 up to last year. You can see here in this area, early part of the 2000s, gas output was declining. It hit a low in 2006. But something happened in 2006. They started employing some new technology out in Dallas-Fort Worth area, a play called the Barnett Shale, and began to hear, wow, the production there is just astounding. And so ever since then, we've seen natural gas production steadily ramp up. Even with prices kind of going in the tank, natural gas production has continued to climb. And we're at 81 billion cubic feet of gas a day. Now that doesn't mean much to you, but that's a whole lot of gas. And we were at a low down here of about 55 or something like that. So that's a big change. And now there's an abundance of gas. According to the American Gas Association, the potential resources are 2.5 trillion cubic feet. Again, a big number, but that's a lot of gas. Our annual consumption's about 26.7 trillion cubic feet. So you can divide that, that's roughly 100, right? 100 years of resource identified. And technology continues to identify more and more resource that's recoverable. So shale has been the game changer. And this is that same, well, actually this is a map of all of North America, but you can see all of the shale plays, including, right in our neighborhood here, the most prolific shale play to this point in the world. But this extends on up into Canada. Some of it is rich with oil, some of it's dry gas, some of it's so-called wet or rich gas, which contains very valuable natural gas liquids. Texas, of course, Oklahoma, always been a big play, still is. But what's changed is up our way. And if you look back, all of the significant oil plays were in those same areas historically. Oil and gas was really discovered in western Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio, back around Civil War days. And that was identifying pockets of gas and oil that had bubbled up out of the shale, historically got trapped by some kind of rock or clay cap and formed a pool, or even came to the surface. And that's what the drillers identified and took advantage of historically. Well, they kind of sucked all those pools dry over time. That moved to Oklahoma and Texas, up into Canada, various places like that. But all that production was declining until they could go way down into the shale and change the technology and get into the shale with horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing to free up that gas that's trapped in very, very tight spaces within rock. And if you look at that rock, you say, well, there's no way that could contain hydrocarbon, but it does. It's trapped in almost microscopic pores, and that's why you have to crack it with the hydraulic fracturing to open that up so the gas will flow. So it's an interesting process, and especially when it's all done, a mile or 2 or 3 miles under the earth, drilled down and horizontally. The technology's kind of space age kind of stuff, and in fact, a lot of the directional control and everything did emanate from the space program. So here's the U.S. kind of blowing up from that previous map, and again, the big play is up here, the Marcellus and the Utica Shale, where we are. This is the U.S. Geological Service, who's always a bit more conservative, but this kind of caps the oil and gas reserves, and they're a little more conservative. They say it's only 1.5 trillion cubic feet, or I'm sorry, 1,500 trillion cubic feet instead of 2,500. So a big difference. However, the industry generally is closer to it and generally forecasts higher numbers. So this is the American Gas Association. And notice of that 2.5 quadrillion cubic feet, the big plays in the Northeast are the Atlantic, which includes the Utica, Marcellus, and a little bit of offshore. So we're here. We're in the right place. And really, the country in North America is really blessed with this resource. It's unlike any place in the world. Even more hydrocarbon here within the 48 states than Saudi Arabia and the Mideast have. And that's hard to imagine because everybody thinks that's where it's at. But that's pretty concentrated over there. So at one time, this whole country must have been underwater, deep underwater, and a lot of plant and vegetation life settled to the bottom and formed these shale layers, which over time decay and heat and pressure and all that kind of thing form hydrocarbons. The Utica and the Marcellus plays, this kind of shows where they are. So this is oil production in the U.S., and it didn't amount to much back here at the end of 2012. This is really growth, actually. So it started growing, in the first part of this decade, and it grew steadily up until the price really went in the tank long about the first part of or middle of 2015. And then production significantly declined. I just heard this morning on the way over that its production's been up for 5 consecutive months, and that's the longest streak for quite a while. So it recovers quickly once the price goes up. Meanwhile, oil imports to the U.S., which had declined during that period, went back up. OPEC turned the spigot on, flooded the market. Shale oil was quite prolific, and all of that caused the price to go really, really low. It's great for filling our tanks at the pump and all that, but it's devastating to the industry. And of course, we saw that around here. A lot of the activity that had started up, a lot of the companies here to support exploration, drilling, and production scaled back, and some folded their tent. This is a different metric. This is exports from the U.S. of refined products, or it also includes natural gas, LNG. So you can see up until 2011, we were a net importer, but that all changed. We've been an exporter of refined products. And that's kind of amazing because for years, all of the refineries were being shut down, they were being mothballed, no money was being put into them other than the requirements for EPA requirements for different blends of fuels. So to see that happen and for the U.S. to be a competitive producer compared to the Mid-East and the Far East and lots of other parts of the world, that's pretty amazing. And that's all a result of the shale. Sorry, I went the wrong way. Okay, and what's also interesting that all of this was done with private money. If you look at the activity on, this is oil production. The gold curve is private lands. This is gas production. And in federal lands, because of restrictions in drilling and permitting and setting areas, vast areas aside that are off limits, that activity actually declined during that period. So it wasn't government promotion, it was all done by private industry, by economics, by the system working. We got so much gas though that we store it underground to cover peaks and peak demand. And traditionally that's because the gas came from Oklahoma, Texas, places like that, through long pipelines up to the Northeast, and I'll show you that in a second. But now we're producing it here. And the problem is you couldn't push enough through those pipes to cover the peak demand periods in the winter or the peak summer cooling season. So the storage is an important buffer. It's like an elastic band. So it's also a place to store gas when the price is low and then hopefully sell it when the price is high. So it's sort of like putting it in the bank, so to speak. Well, traditionally, they start storing gas, coming out of the winter season. They start storing gas and it starts increasing here in April. Well, this year, kind of a mild winter, but there's also so much production, they actually started storing gas in February. So lots and lots of gas and no place to put it. That means price probably stay low. That's what I'll show you later on. So where's natural gas used? This is in quadrillion of BTUs. Okay, that's if you're a mathematician, that's 10 to the power of 15. So you have millions, billions, trillions, and then quadrillions. And I can't think any far beyond that. That's a whole lot. But we use about 27 quadrillion BTUs a year. The whole country uses a little bit short of 100 quadrillion BTUs of total energy. So 28% of that roughly is natural gas in 2016. The biggest user is electric power generation. Industrial is pretty significant, and that's a lot of things. That's factories, that's feedstock for chemical plants, things of that nature. Commercial, is businesses, hotels, things like that, residential, and then a certain amount of it is consumed in getting it to market from the wellhead or leaks and things like that, and that's in my talk later this month to an industry association, I'm going to hammer them on that number because that's an opportunity and it's also an environmental concern. So let's talk about the environmental record from a decade of strong activity. This is a quick snapshot of the sources for power generation from 2009 to current time and projecting going forward. And you look at coal, the black one, you can see that's continually going down. Two reasons for that. One are the environmental regulations that have made coal plants unattractive, and the other is the price of gas, the cost of gas compared to coal is much attractive. So in the middle here is natural gas. You can see it's grown. Actually, it's expected to pull back a little bit this year because the price is going up a little bit, so coal begins to be a little bit more competitive, but that's a temporary measure, it appears. Nuclear still hanging in there, but not growing and not forecast to grow in this country. And then, petroleum hardly on the radar. Renewables, hydropower, of course, that significant but not growing. And hydropower is great, but how much more land do you want to flood to make more dams, to make more hydro plants? Not a popular move anywhere. And so that's unlikely to become more significant. But that's generally characterized in the renewables as a number, and it's a significant part of the total renewable number. But the other renewables, what we think of, would be things like ethanol, as well as solar and wind. And you can see they've been growing nicely, but the problem is they're still a very, very small piece of the total equation. And this is just power generation. This is not all energy. This is just power generation. So remember that, because as we talk, and we talk about, some of the movements in opposition to fossil fuels, if they're successful, we all have a big problem. Natural gas is environmentally friendly, and these are facts. This is from API, the American Petroleum Institute, but emits less than half the emissions of coal. The industry's really did a nice job of not being wasteful. 94% reduction in leaks from pipelines. And really, when it happens today, it's a major deal. It's live at 5 and film at 11 on TV. Everybody in the world finds out about it immediately. So the industry is real sensitive to doing the right thing there for safety reasons, but also just because of public image. That's equivalent, this is interesting, that's equivalent to 25 million car traffic jam wrapped around the Earth 3 times for a year. So that's a lot of emissions that has been reduced from leaks since 1984. Natural gas represents only 2% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. So production's been up 37%, while greenhouse gas emissions have been down 17%. So why is that? Mostly because it's displaced coal, which creates a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And natural gas, not so much. So here's another picture. It shows the methane emissions going down and kind of leveling out while production's going up steadily and significantly. Here we're down here about 80, and up here we're about 230, so almost 3 times increase in production, while emissions have declined and held steady. So those are facts. These are all government numbers from the Energy Information Administration. You can pick them off their website. If you root around long enough, it's all there. This is CO2 emissions, and again, in the U.S., continually coming down and forecast to go down or at least stabilize. Let's look at the economic record over the last 10 years. Natural gas is a cheap energy source. So here we are now. Here's natural gas. It's gone up a little bit, but it's forecast to stay pretty low, and this is kind of the consumer price, but clear out to 2040 because we have so much of it and it's so readily available, or should be. price is expected to stay about where it is for the next 30 years or so. And that's very important. That's a real benefit to the country, to individuals. If you look at the other things, fuel oil, electricity will continue to go up. There's lots of reasons for that. One of them is, the increase in renewables is great, but it costs a lot to put them in place. And as I'll show you, they're not available all the time, so you have to have backup supplies. And so you kind of have to have double generation, and you got to turn things on and off and manage all that. So the power companies have an interesting time trying to manage the intermittent characteristics of the renewables. And then propane, which is actually comes from some of the wet gas over in eastern Ohio and southeast Pennsylvania, that's expected to drop considerably and stay at a nice rate going forward. So the propane as well as the natural gas are benefits of the shale. Oil is priced more in a worldwide market, so probably won't see as much long-term benefit on that. Plus, we don't have as much oil as we have gas. If you compare that to the rest of the world, this is natural gas. The line down here is the US. The black line is the UK. Now they have some gas in the North Sea, quite a lot of it. And they also import LNG. And then you got poor Japan, who doesn't have anything, and they have to import it all in LNG tankers. Actually, there is forecast to be a huge increase in LNG from Australia and Indonesia. So they're actually going to see that market benefit them. So that price is going to go down. And that affects some of the exports from the US as well, which I'll talk about later. But at any rate, we've had a good track record of cheap natural gas. The oil and gas industry pays high wages. This top line is extraction and refineries, pipelines. The average is 6 figures. This is data put out by the American Petroleum Institute. The U.S. average is about half of the oil and gas industry. So people work hard, sometimes messy work. You're out in the mud and the dirt and got dirt on your fingernails, or you're an engineer sitting in an office, and you've paid a lot for an education, but you're well paid. Believe that as somebody who's hired a lot of people. You've got a heck of a payroll, and it's not easy to find experienced talent, so you have to train them. But roughly twice the average U.S. wage. So it's important to the economy. And what a lot of people don't realize, because it's easy to hammer, big oil and big gas, they pay more taxes, percentage-wise, than any other industry that you look at, almost 39%. So despite the so-called tax breaks, and there are some, U.S. Oil and gas industry really gets hammered on taxes. Now, one reason is that they tend to be big and they make a lot of money, so they're in high tax brackets. But there's other reasons for that, but net result is that they pay a lot of tax. And who owns the big oil companies? It's not some oil baron. It's not a John D. Rockefeller kind of person anymore, like it once was. Yeah, there may be some corporate managers that are very rich because of the stock they own and the money they make. But it's owned by mutual funds. Anybody own a mutual fund? You say, well, no. Or anybody own individual stocks? All right, anybody got a pension? Anybody got an IRA? Of course, all of those have investments in oil and gas companies. So when you look at it, and then there's other institutional investors, so really a pretty small piece of the pie is not owned, say, by major investors or the funds that we all benefit from, or hopefully will be when we retire. So a little bit of the economic background. Now there are critical pathways for gas to market. Okay, gas is not like oil. You can't put it in a truck and haul it away. Well, you can, but that's quite a process to do that. It's not very competitive. So it's transported through an underground pipeline system, and there's a number of pipelines right through this area. There are new pipelines being put in, and you'd think with all this grid that we wouldn't need anymore, but the problem is you got to have a pipe to where it's produced. And so sometimes that can be a short connection to something that's already there. or it may be a major line like the Rover pipelines being built up across northern Ohio right now. And that's all to carry Utica and Marcellus gas back into the Midwest and really up into this area here, up to where the population and the consumption exists. Interestingly, some of the heaviest concentration of pipelines is right in our neighborhood. And again, that again dates back to the 1800s and early 1900s when oil and gas, this was the oil patch and the gas patch in western Pennsylvania. So we have a lot of that grid here historically. Of course, Texas and Oklahoma and the Midwest, which is kind of the hub. So it's amazing to me that, you know, we got all of this pipe and we still need more. But 20% of all energy consumption is natural gas, as I showed you earlier. And 2014, that was delivered, and here's the number, you know, safely through 2.5 million miles of underground pipelines. So when you hear the protests about pipe going in going to damage the water supply, it could, but there's a heck of a lot of it out there that's got a good track record. So, you know, it's very unlikely that it's going to be a problem if it's done right. So 2011, this is the network, and the traditional flows came up here to the northeast and to the Midwest. Huge amounts came out of Canada. Not shown here is a huge intercontinental pipeline from Western Canada, Alberta, and British Columbia. There's a lot of gas transported across the continent to the east and then to the south. What's happening now? It's going the other way. A lot of the pipelines have been reversed, and we're actually exporting gas out of this region. Some of it goes to Canada, but most of it goes to the south, to the east coast, or to the Midwest. And then even more importantly, down here, we're starting to export a lot of gas through pipelines to Mexico. And Mexico has a lot of gas and a lot of oil, but historically it's been government controlled and mismanaged, I guess I'll be kind in saying that. Just not handled very well. So they've actually opened it up to general industry to come in and to work there and develop the resource. But in the meantime, their demands are such that they've got to export a lot of, or import a lot of natural gas and oil. So let's compare natural gas to some other energy sources. This is kind of from the beginning of time, beginning of the country. This is energy consumption, different kind of fuels. So you can see petroleum started here in the after the Civil War. It's been up and down, but it's remained high. Petroleum is essentially oil, and about all of our cars and trucks still burn gasoline made from oil. Natural gas has really grown here over the last decade with shale. Coal was a big part of our economy for almost a century, but it's declined rapidly in the last 10 years. Nuclear, kind of started up here, but then, everybody's scared of nuclear, and it's very expensive to create a plant. It takes a decade or two to put a plant in and get it approved and everything. So it's leveled off and probably going to decline. Biomass, theoretically great stuff, but when you look at the energy balance to make ethanol and to use corn and valuable farmland for that, a lot of questions are raised. But biomass, has grown. Other renewables, way down here, the green thing, and then hydroelectric, it's developed, but it's still pretty small. So you look at this historically, it's all hydrocarbons. Whether you like that or not, it's a fact. And it is unlikely to change in the foreseeable future. Consumption by fuel in 2014, natural gas, oil, coal, nuclear, and renewables. And renewables include hydroelectric as well as wind, solar, and biofuels. And this is all energy. This is not just power generation. So you can see oil and gas make up, more than 60%, about 2/3 of the total. Globally, The demand for oil continues to grow. It's grown the last couple of years. It leveled out here slightly, but demand has picked up again and will continue to pick up, and that's because there's a lot of parts of the world that are, traditionally third world that are becoming industrialized. And that's a problem because they're going to demand a lot more energy than they have traditionally. That's got to come from somewhere. On the other side of the coin, when you look at the environmental impacts, and even if we cut our emissions to zero, which is really not practical, they're going to continue to grow, and I'll show you a projection of that later. Supply and use. This shows the trends. This is natural gas, and you can see shale from 2012 on out projected to 2022. Shale gas will be the main source of natural gas. And in the usage side, power will continue to grow, industrial will grow, the others not so much. LNG exports, up here at the top, liquid natural gas is LNG. That's going to become significant. What's missing on here? CNG vehicles. It's on there, but you can't find it. It's such a small piece, and that's because oil is so cheap. And we don't have a CNG service or filling station at every corner, so it's not convenient. The EIA, that's a government part of the Energy Information Administration. It's part of the Department of Energy. Keeps a lot of statistics commissioned to study, and they projected energy production, all forms, through 2050. Consider all forms of energy. Indicated that petroleum liquid imports will likely fall and natural gas exports increase over that period. Total production from all sources will increase about 20% through 2040, led by increases in crude oil and natural gas. But the increases in crude and natural gas would mean U.S. energy production could increase by 50%. So they really say 20% on a conservative, most likely scenario, but in the best case, it could grow by 50%. So that's a big difference. Exports are highest and grow throughout the production period. In the case where we've got relatively flat demand and strong production and increasing improvements in technology, which appear to be happening already. One of the benefits of the downturn in the last couple of years is it forced companies, producers, to get more efficient and to keep improving technology so they can now produce more with less cost and less effort. So they're drilling less and getting more, so to speak. This is kind of the graph of what they're saying. So dry natural gas moving forward will continue to grow. Crude oil and liquid hydrocarbons derived from natural gas will grow a little bit and kind of level off. Coal continued to go down. The green one is other renewable energy other than hydro. Hydro is the blue one down here. Interestingly, natural gas liquids down here grows significantly from what it has been and levels off. But interesting here is natural gas goes up, renewables go up, but look at the difference. So by 2050, renewables are still a relatively small piece according to the government's own forecast. So again, plant that seed in your mind when we talk about the concerns about opposition. Clean energy, energy-related CO2 will decline in most scenarios. So even with the increased use of natural gas, because of the reduction in coal and because people are getting better at minimizing the emissions from any kind of combustion, continue to see a decline in CO2. That's a good thing. Whether you believe we're affecting climate change or not, it's still a good thing. As a minimum, it's more efficient. On a percentage basis, renewable energy increases the fastest. It's already small, so a percentage increase can be very significant. However, that's promoted by federal policies that encourage its use, and some of the subsidies do run out over time unless they're extended. Biofuels is constrained. Mainly it's a transportation issue and blending limitations like the ethanol standards in gasoline. You know, a lot of people are saying that they're really not practical. There's not enough supply, you don't have it on time, and it's damaging maybe to the vehicles. So science needs to dictate rather than politicians. But it's unlikely we're going to see a lot of benefit from biofuels in the foreseeable future. Wind power capacity could double by 2023, and that's pretty significant. Parts of the country, you drive around, you see a lot of windmills. They're big. Unfortunately, most of the material for that is not made in this country, but at least they're installed here, and they do, once they're in service, they're really low-cost sources of energy when the wind blows. After 2023, the forecast is that's going to drop off in terms of new production or new generation. Consumption, the power sector remains the largest consumer of primary energy. It's going to grow in all cases, and depending on the growth of the economy, it could grow a lot or not so much. It should increase over the next 23 years unless there's a major slowdown in the economy. What else here? Natural gas use increases more than any other fuel in terms of quantity of energy consumed, led by the demand from the industrial and the power generation sector. Petroleum consumption, again that's oil, remains relatively flat because of energy efficiency increases, which offset growth. Coal consumption decreases as coal loses market share to gas and renewables. So that's the EIA's forecast, and that's a report that came out in January of this year. And you can actually go to their website and find that report if you're interested in more of the detail. Again, EIA predicts that, if you look at our energy imports, we kind of went up. Shale gas helped bring it down. It's going to level out, but we're going to be a net exporter of energy pretty darn quick. Not oil, but gas, everything together, all energy sources, we're going to be a net exporter. 10 years ago, people would have thought we're crazy. We're building LNG import terminals. Now we built LNG export terminals, and the first of those went into production about a year ago. But a concern, and it's a big concern within our industry, because, and you've seen some of this on TV, mostly late last year, but opposition to further development of hydrocarbons here in the States and around the world. And what the activists have decided is, let's not go after the individual wells and the drilling. Let's prevent the pipelines from being put in, because if you don't have the pipeline, you can't move the gas to market. It's not worth much. It's stranded. And so you saw the Dakota Access Pipeline and all the stuff that went on up there. And you see a lot of other protests going on. So there's a lot of misinformation, and environmental resistance to fossil fuels is growing. And I don't want to trash these people. They have their own perceptions and points of view. But I like facts. I like to look at the real world, not an imaginary one. So part of the distortion, I believe natural gas is a clean, cheap alternative fossil fuels. Well, what's wrong with that statement? Natural gas is a fossil fuel, right? So the facts and the benefits aren't understood by the average person in the public. And pipelines, right? I showed you this grid. Which pipeline is going to ruin the drinking water? You add another one. Could it? Yeah. But is it likely to? Very, very low probability. But these are the kind of things that the so-called keep it in the ground activists are starting to take advantage of. And the resistance is emotional. It's not logical, it's not factual, it's emotional. The opposition's well organized. There are 10,000 nonprofit environmental groups in the U.S., and there's a new one added every day. That's a stat I got earlier this year from one of the pipeline industries. There's been 10, I think that's wrong, I think it was $10 billion, it should say, of charitable contributions last year to environmental groups. There's a group called, you can go to their website, 350.org, and their whole mission in life is to reduce the CO2 in the atmosphere to 350 parts per million. It's 400 now, so we're talking about a significant reduction at a time when the worldwide economies are all pushing it the other way. And they're all over the world advocating this. So they think if we shut down all fossil fuels, we can get there. Well, my pushback is, okay, let's do that. What are we going to give up if we do that? And it gets pretty radical. It's a Chicken Little syndrome, I call it. The sky is falling, the ocean's rising, and maybe some of those things are happening. Climate change is real. It always has been. To what extent can we affect it is really the question. And I think sometimes we think we can be God, when in fact there's forces beyond our control. But the resistance is emotional, it's passionate, and there's lots and lots of examples all over the world. And the other thing that's been seen lately is the activists are all linking together. They found out, well, this group and that group are pretty small, but if they're pooled together, they can reinforce each other. So climate change, LGBT rights, women's rights, civil rights, animal rights, Native Americans, unions, endangered species, and so on, you'll find teaming together in a lot of these protests. The examples just go on and on. There's a group called FANG, Fighting Against Natural Gas. You can actually go to their website, and these are all from some of their initiatives. And it goes on and on. This is very well organized and funded by a lot of money. So learn the facts, know them, and communicate them is my message to our industry and to the public. And I also say be careful when you follow the masses. Sometimes the M is silent. So it behooves us to kind of be the evangelists to our family, our friends, and our neighbors. And again, not trashing those people, but asking people to wake up and just look at what we're dealing with here. And it's not a simple solution. And you can't simply ban fossil fuels and expect life to go on in the foreseeable future. So it's a very real problem. While 80% of American voters supposedly support increased oil and gas production, a vocal minority are working to obstruct energy development and infrastructure projects, reducing our energy options under a false belief that oil and gas production are incompatible with environmental progress. And as I've showed you the stats, they already demonstrate that we can have environmental progress and at the same time increasing production and usage. And the U.S. educational system is misleading an entire generation. I talk to my grandkids, and they're all kind of brainwashed, Oh, you're in that fracking business? Well, I'm not, but my livelihood depends on it. But, why do you think it's bad? Well, my teacher told me so. Well, we need to talk with your teacher and share with her some more information. And too often, a political side takes one side or the other without using common sense. So no matter which party you are, they go to extreme ends typically rather than find a reasonable middle ground solution. This group is the energy equipment industry of America. So it's kind of the construction companies and things like that put in facilities and put in pipelines. They did a study of the consequences of the Keep It in the Ground movement. So without pipelines, fossil energy can't be produced and can't be consumed. People who crusade to eliminate all fossil fuels know this and have made stopping pipelines their top priority. No fossil fuel extremists are taking their Dakota Access playbook on the road, and they're now focused on this area, the Appalachian Basin. Some of the projects up in the Northeast, down along the coast, that take some of this Utica and Marcellus gas to markets that really need it are being resisted by these groups. And of course, they're supercharged by Trump, by the Trump election. You know, they're automatically opposed to Trump and that whole thing, so this all fits together. As an example, the Sierra Club had a 700% increase in donations and 30,000 new online monthly donors in the 10 weeks following the election. So this is big resistance. These are big numbers. And the effect is not going to be insignificant. So this is what the industry behind the scenes has to deal with. All the major crude, natural gas, and NGL, natural gas liquid pipeline projects that are in the approval process add up to about 8,500 miles of pipe, 3.5 million compression horsepower, and that's the industry I'm in, and $56 billion of project cost, all privately funded, not government funded, privately funded investment in infrastructure. So we talk about plowing government money into infrastructure to create jobs. Don't have to pay taxes to do this. In fact, in doing this, these companies pay taxes in return. So without pipelines, our gas in this area is stranded. Prices available to producers are depressed. That limits production, limits revenue, it limits royalties to landowners, limits taxes, and it definitely affects economic development. So this is something that, you know, all of us can be affected by if this movement gains more traction. Further consequences, this is by a study commissioned and performed by a third party, commissioned by API and just released last month. Consequences of keeping the hydrocarbon in the ground. The average U.S. household's energy cost would jump $4,500 by 2040. Potential increase in crude oil by $40 a barrel. Okay, it's at 48 or 49 this morning, so it's going to double. Natural gas down around 10, it's going to be 21, so it's going to double. Retail electricity will go by 56%. It costs almost 6 million jobs and $11.8 trillion of cumulative gross domestic product. And there's more and more metrics. In reality, the U.S. leads the world in both the reduction of carbon emissions and the production and refining of oil and gas. So, again, I'd like to look at facts. So let's say fossil fuels are bad, we're not going to have them anymore. What's the alternative? Well, it must be renewables, right? Let's have a look. And this cartoon kind of sums it up, you know. If you look at Mother Goose and Grimm, he's got a tendency to go have a drink every once in a while. And the caption here, I love the free refill policy at this restaurant. So it kind of equates to this. What are the extremists drinking? Nothing good comes for free. We got to educate ourselves, our friends, our family, our neighbors. There's no free lunch, there's no free drink. So drilling down into the details. This was a government news release from late last year, the National Renewable Energy, forget what the L stands for. So it said, you know, great news, renewables reach 16.7% of the U.S. total electric power, not all energy, just power, capacity in 2015. Well, that capacity is not always usable. So the renewables really accounted for 13.8%, about 3% less, of total power generation. And that's because the capacity is intermittent. If you drill down into that some more, of that 13.8, 6.1, or 40% of the total, was hydroelectric. As I showed you before, that's not growing. That's been there for a good long time. It's good, but it's not growing. So that leaves 7.7% generated by wind and solar. And although that's growing rapidly, you can see 7.7% of our power generation, that's a long way from covering our needs. And that didn't fuel hardly any vehicles. Yeah, there are some electric cars, but not many. It doesn't fuel airplanes. You know, think of all the other places oil is used or gas is used. It doesn't begin to meet our needs. So what do we do for the next 50 years without, you know, what's the solution? We've got to have gas. This demonstrates the intermittency of the wind supply. The green line is the output of wind, The yellow line is the requirement. So you can see here, it's too much produced. And there isn't really a good way to store it, but it exceeds demand, so you got to shut them down. You can't utilize the wind. Here, for whatever reason, they aren't producing. The wind isn't blowing, or maybe it's stormy and they have to shut them down because of impingement problems from rain and hail and ice. And so, what do? You shut out all the lights, turn off all the heat? No, you got to have some other backup supply. So that's fundamentally the problem with both wind and solar. It's great stuff, but it's something you can't control. It's not like, lighting the fire, turning on a switch and it's there or it's off. You're dependent on the natural events to determine how much it produces. So you have to manage that. So this is renewables' share of total U.S. energy, not just power generation. And all renewables make up 9%. That's not trivial, but gosh, 9%. And of that, 4.7 of it is biomass, 2.6 is hydroelectric, and a whopping 1.6 comes from wind, and a 0.09% from solar. So this was 2013, okay, 3 or 4 years ago, so a little bit dated, but it hadn't changed drastically. So again, the point is, the renewables are a small piece of our total needs. So, I throw this back to those that would oppose fossil fuels. Well, what do we do? And globally, it's even worse. This is global energy demand up through 2014. Oil is the biggest. Coal's right behind it. Natural gas, pretty significant. Hydro, nuclear, and here's renewables. Not a very significant factor, despite all of the renewables that have gained favor in Europe. The future U.S. energy demand, here we are today, and you can see that of that, natural gas is going to have the biggest growth opportunity. Oil isn't going to go away, mainly because of transportation fuel. Renewables, hydro isn't going to do much. Biomass and renewables is the blue one. Not forecast through 2040 to grow into a very significant share. Okay, it's about 9% is about all it's going to be. And even if there's government favoritism or promotion, let's double it, let's triple it, let's quadruple it, we're still short of half of what we need. So it's just not practical to rely on renewables only. We need to promote them, we need to continue to develop them, but they're not going to get us there. And the same problem happens worldwide. Here's another thing that really can keep you awake at night. This, I think I showed a version of this when I spoke a couple of years ago. This is the total energy use per person, per capita. This is kind of the economic output per capita. So, the U.S. is up here. It's been growing in output. However, its energy consumption's been pretty stable. Australia, another highly developed part of the world, has continued to develop, but it's used more energy, but it's behind the U.S. Japan, same trend. Much more compact society, so their transportation costs are a lot lower than ours. One of the problems that we have in Australia too is, we're all spread out. The population density is pretty low, and everybody has their own vehicle. And so that's not very efficient. Korea. But here's the world average. Now, if that continues to grow, and just say it follows Japan's history, look at where that's going to be by the time the rest of the world reaches the kind of economic prosperity, should it ever happen, that we enjoy. We're going to see a doubling, a tripling, probably, of energy needs. Big issue. So future global energy demand, it's going to continue to go up. And this shows the relative contributions to all this. The world is projected to require 56% more energy 30 years down the road, actually 23 years from now. Think of it another way. The U.S. produces about 100 quadrillion BTU of energy a year, 100 quads. The world uses about 600. By 2030, that's just 13 years away, the projected worldwide usage is 700 quads. Put that in perspective, that's like adding all of the consumption of the U.S. in 13 years to the world needs. So all of the energy we have has to double for the world in 13 years. How will it be produced? Where will it come from? That's not going to, unfortunately, for a lot of folks, going to come from renewables. It's going to have to come from fossil fuels, or economic prosperity is going to have to not only be limited, it's going to have to decline. And the other troubling thing is that these are the carbon emissions. Here is the developed world, the blue line. And this is history, this is not projection. Where the developing nations, look what's happened. Look what's, So developing nations actually are producing more carbon emissions than the developed world. I think I read recently where, I don't want to get this right, but China starts up a new coal plant like every other week, or maybe, it's every other week, I think. So kind of ridiculous. No coal plants being put in this country for mainly environmental reasons, but other parts of the world are going full blast. So we could cut everything out and the world's still going to be subject to increased carbon emissions. So that's a dilemma. And really I wanted to capture the metric down here. Should the U.S. reduce our standard of living so the development world can increase theirs? I don't know about you, but I don't know anything against them, but I like where I live, and I like the society we have, and without some of the things that we enjoy, and without hydrocarbons, that will change drastically. So, will we have another decade of natural gas and oil resurgence? This back in February, I helped organize a conference in Houston, and we had 4 key analyst companies that study this space talk. So some of the experts literally in the U.S. and literally the world on the subject. So I've borrowed a lot of their comments and metrics here. Also had American Electric Power from Columbus speak there. So got some stuff straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So natural gas, it's a demand challenge. We got more of it than we got needs for. Well, that's a good thing. Unless you're in the industry, trying to find markets for that gas. It says that growth is going to be somewhat constrained, but the good side of that is that the price stays low, becomes very attractive. And the amount of gas that is economic to be produced depends on the price, but I'll show you a curve here in a second. A whole lot of gas is available at $4 per million BTUs, or another metric is $4 per 1,000 cubic feet roughly. And there's over 700 at $3. Those are pretty low prices compared to historic numbers. It's in the low 3s right now. The risks are from concentration of production. Pipeline expansion is a strong dependency, and there's a challenge of matching supply growth to demand growth. Production of oil has increased, and along with that, there's an increase in what's called associated gas, oil that comes off, or gas that comes off with the oil, not just dry gas. And that has grown and is expected to be one of the one of the strong increases in production. 2017 is a little bit of a tight supply situation because of the pipelines they're kind of full, and they have to finish the new ones. So gas prices have actually gone up a little bit, and there's some switching of power generation back to coal. Hard to believe that's happening, but it is where that option and flexibility still exists. A likely surplus in gas after 2017 because of the surge in associated gas from oil production and completion of some of the pipeline expansions. In the U.S., shale and U.S. exports are changing how the global gas prices get set. So it's caused the LNG market for gas to go down in price. It's good for the world, but instead of selling LNG for the equivalent of $8 per million BTU, it's probably going to be more 5 or 6. But if we're producing it at 3, it still might be marketable. This is the metric that shows the production that's available at certain price levels. So the $4 range is here, 1,400 trillion cubic feet. Or at $3, it's back here. It's not marked, but it's 700. Okay, so what's the Trump effect? In the industry, we have a lot of discussion about that. Well, it's not utopia, okay? And it's hard to read. No matter your political persuasion, it definitely changes the game. So there are some marginal effects potentially. For one thing, it doesn't change the reality of the resource base that's largely on private lands. So it's something the government, doesn't have direct control over. If the shale revolution occurred under Obama, it's not likely to be slowed by Trump. So that's pretty much a favorable thing to the industry. However, toward the end of the Obama term, there were obstacles to infrastructure developments and new drilling, and they were gathering force and momentum. And the interveners were, getting somewhat of a support from the federal government, like the famous pipeline, that, after 2 or 6 years of study, even though it's not projected to cause any harm, not going to approve it. And then the Dakota Access Pipeline. Well, those interveners are no longer likely to be joined by a supportive federal government. So, that is what it is. That's favorable and kind of good news for the infrastructure that will allow some of these projects to go forward and let us enjoy continued supply of natural gas at low prices. Infrastructure development and drilling plans may occur largely on schedule without regulatory delays. The regulations are extreme. I've written articles recently in some of the industry trade journals about all the processes that are in place for regulatory review and all the agencies that interact and all the permits that are required, and it's quite extensive, it's quite expensive, and it takes time. And then the public can get involved, and then when that all gets approved and then there's still opposition, some of those government agencies would throw up their hands, well, we got to take another look at this, so it just drags on and on and on and on. And that's problematic. If you pass muster and it's approved, you ought to be able to proceed. But it became wishy-washy. So I suspect that's going to change a little bit. Once the decision's made, it's made. One thing that's a concern is the talk of a border adjustment tax. Sounds like a good idea. However, if that happens, that probably is going to severely limit the amount of exporting of oil and gas that we can do. There will be resistance to that from other countries. So that's this company's assessment of the effect of Trump. On price and supply impacts, oil, unlikely that large new territories will be developed. So you see favoritism to, well, let's drill offshore, let's open up Alaska. Those projects take more than 4 years. It's unlikely companies are going to invest big money, billions and maybe trillions of dollars developing new plays that take more than 4 years to begin to produce. When there's a risk that in 4 years there's a different administration with a different philosophy. So it's unlikely we're going to see a big change from what we've got today. So shale plays are probably going to continue to be the prevalent source of natural gas. The Appalachian supplies may be more unleashed with limited price appreciation because of the pipeline projects, and exports to Mexico are unlikely to be affected. That should continue to go forward, although there is some risk that, you know, if Mexico gets further crossways with us, they may say, well, we don't want your gas. They need it, but they may decide politically they don't want it. So there's always issues. You know, there's nuclear war in North Korea. I mean, there's so many things to worry about that, you know, if you can remember a few years ago, we all had our, not all of you remember this, a few are from that age, but, you know, we had bomb shelters, you know, and we were worried about who's going to set off the next nuclear war. And it was, you know, we've been through some pretty tough times and we've come out of it with success. So this is projected oil production over the next few years. You can see it grew rapidly and it peaked, declined. It's continued to decline last year, but it's actually picking up at a little faster rate than what this curve would indicate. This is in the lower 48. This is not Alaska. And because of that oil production, we see that associated gas also increased. So it declined with the oil production, but it's ramping back up. So that's gas that's produced with oil, mostly in Texas and Oklahoma and North Dakota. The sources of gas from traditional plays continues to go down. Associated gas is very significant and it continues to grow. And the rest comes from Appalachia. More than 40% of all the gas right about now and going forward comes from Appalachia, from the Marcellus and Utica Shale. We're sitting on the edge of that, obviously. This shows some of the individual plays, associated gas, Marcellus in Pennsylvania and West Virginia. The Utica is really growing, and that's what's predominantly affected our neighborhood here. And as infrastructure expands to get that gas to market, all of these grow some more. Incremental gas production, these are just some of the numbers, projected to continue to climb. So 2017, 5.3 billion cubic feet a day. By 2021, 17. So, you know, more than 3 times more gas coming out of this area. And a good bit of that from the Utica. You see Utica almost begins to match Marcellus. Pretty interesting how that play is really huge. This is a little busy, but what I wanted to show you here are the various pipelines up in this neighborhood connecting. These are the traditional pipelines. You might remember the REX, the Rockies Express pipeline. It was built all the way from the Rocky Mountains a few years ago, and it ends at the Ohio River. And there's a compressor station over by Chandlersville that's part of that line. Well, that was built to move Rocky Mountain gas all the way to the East Coast in the Midwest. It kind of got as far as the Midwest, and you know, there wasn't demand here because the shale started happening. And so it was never really used for its intended purpose to any degree. In fact, some of the compressor stations in this part of the neighborhood, you know, they really weren't used. Well, guess what? It's been reversed. The equipment's been reconfigured, it's been expanded. It's actually taken gas east to west, starting back here in 2014. So if you look at those, TGP is the Tennessee gas pipeline. It's actually a compressor station near here that's been there for years and years. And that was to push gas from the south west up to the northeast. It's now essentially going the other way. And that was 0.9 BCF a day. Texas Eastern, which is another line passing through this area, 2 billion. And then the REX, the one I talked about, is 1.7. So we're exporting almost 5 billion cubic feet a day of gas out of the northeast, out of the Appalachian Basin, which is the Marcellus and Utica shales. These are pipeline projects. I won't get into this, but if you can kind of see the dashes on this map, you can see where all the new pipelines are going in. And yeah, there's some down here in Texas, there's a little bit going to Mexico, but all of these are to expand the pathway for the Appalachian gas to market back this way to the upper Midwest or to the central Midwest, and then they connect with an existing lines in that grid. Get over to the East Coast, get down into the Southeast where there isn't a lot of gas and there's a lot of demand and a growing population. They'd like to build more up into the Northeast, but a lot of those states don't want them, so they're going to continue to burn oil or whatever. So lots and lots of pipeline projects. Some of them have been delayed over the last little while. But with all that expansion, what this shows is that we're still going to produce more gas than we can take out of this region in the not too distant future. Now, the pipelines never run at 100% capacity. A lot of reasons for that, but they can get up to 80%, 90%. So the dotted line is 80% full utilization. The solid line is 90%. The vertical columns are production. So you can see right now, 2017, where if we use 90% of the capacity, we're going to use it all up. Here, production exceeds capacity, or exceeds takeaway capacity, and it continues to happen. 2020 forecast to kind of catch up, but so there may be needs for even more pipelines going forward. There's that much gas in our region. So we're sitting on a wealth of potential here. And not just Ohio, but West Virginia and Pennsylvania. All this shows that the projects have gotten pushed out in time over the last year, partially because of the economics of the industry and partially because of stiffer scrutiny by the regulatory agencies under the prior administration. Associated Gas kind of shows where it comes from. The big place, Permian Basin out in West Texas. It's traditionally one of the great oil fields, and it's like been rediscovered. It's just, a year and a half ago, that was like ghost town. Prior to that, hotel rooms, the old rundown Holiday Inn was $300 a night if you could get a room. And a lot of people were sleeping in their trucks. It's not quite back to that level again, but it's really picked up. Eagle Ford's in the middle of Texas. This is a play in Oklahoma that's actually kind of like the Marcellus and the Utica. It's 2 layers, and they can drill down and they can get both of them, and it's oil rich. So this kind of shows, asks the question, we can be energy independent, and forecasts are, yeah, we will be maybe 2020 or thereabouts, energy independent, not oil independent. Because of our reliance on gasoline and fuel oil, we're going to be importing oil most likely for the foreseeable future. But total energy, we may export natural gas and refined products and things like that, so that net will be a net exporter, but will still be a net importer of crude oil. At least that's the current forecast by the, this is actually IHS Energy's forecast. This is a projection out through 2040, showing where is gas going to be used. It's going to increase from about 81 BCF today to about 125. So it's about 50% increase. And what's going to drive that is power generation. It's going to be driven by LNG exports, the gold bar. It's going to be driven by exports to Mexico. And you begin to see a little bit of a thing showing up here, that's vehicles. So as gasoline and oil prices go up, CNG, compressed natural gas, is very cheap. Need more infrastructure, need more vehicles that can use it. It's used widely in other countries, but not so much here. But it will begin at least to appear as a part of the demand. And of course, it's cleaner than some of the alternatives for combustion. Going back to power generation, this kind of shows the trend over the last little bit and going forward. But what it says is that most of the incremental power generation in the next several years is going to be wind and solar. There's a lot of momentum going there. not so much on natural gas. And what is expanded in natural gas is going to be mainly as backup power. So that's what we're looking at going forward. And I'm going to hurry through a couple of these. This was a talk by American Electric Power a while ago. And one of the problems with renewables I wanted to show. This is a study from Germany who's got a lot of wind energy. And they have wind and solar. And they've also got fossil fuels. So the top of all this is the total demand. And of course, the gray is the conventional fossil fuels plus nuclear. The green is wind. The gold is solar. So you can see that wind and solar at times of the year made up a substantial part of the production. Germany's quite advanced in that area. The problem is you can see a few places here where almost all of it was hydrocarbon and nuclear. That was during a 1 week period in April of 2014. Here's a 1 week period in December of 2014, cloudier, whatever, wind wasn't blowing, and almost for a week the renewables were insignificant. The point is they got to have all that capacity to produce the power, or they got to go start shutting off power to you and me and whoever. So it's a problem for the power companies, and this again was an American Electric Power presentation. It's one of the challenges they face in working with renewable sources which are intermittent. Another big demand driver for domestic natural gas is exports of liquid natural gas. And this shows where the facilities are going in. There's 4 down along the Gulf Coast. There's 1 on the East Coast, actually 2 on the East Coast. And the first of those started up last year and began exporting. 35% growth in LNG exports from the end of last year up to 2025. Pretty significant. And if you look at the total volume of gas, we were importing prior to 2015. Last year began to export a little, and it's going to ramp up quickly. And Canada is also going to be exporting LNG. So it goes up significantly. If you remember, we're about 81 BCF per day. Insignificant previously, but last year it was about 4, so it's about 5% of the total. It's going to soon be up to about 10% of the total. Another important thing is that we've gotten more efficient. And if we hadn't gotten efficient, going back here over the last 3 or 4 decades, our demand for energy would have increased hugely. That's one of the reasons that our environmental situation has improved too. Part of it is switch to natural gas. Part of it is that we're just more efficient in the combustion. And that needs to continue, although, as they would say, most of the low-hanging fruit's already been harvested. If you get to 90% efficiency, you've only got 10 left, and getting that extra 10 is very, very difficult. Getting from 70 to 90 is not so hard. Getting from 90 to 95 is really hard. Getting from 95 to 100 is probably impossible. This is an encouraging thing. The prognosticators generally say there's going to be slow, steady, long-term growth for natural gas for the foreseeable future. This is blown all the way out to 2014. And these are the demand drivers. But over the next roughly 10 years, we're going to see an increase of about 2.5 billion cubic feet per day of increased demand. After that, it'll slow down to about 1.5. But still, that's a pretty good growth rate. It means that there's going to be the need for more production, more activity. The shale wells play out, right? They're very prolific, but they have a decline curve that's pretty steep. So you got to keep expanding into more parts of the shale. That's more wells, that's more activity. That's maybe more connecting pipelines. So it all drives more activity, more infrastructure, more lease payments, all those kind of things, more taxes. Price forecast, going to be pretty stable for next several years. So strategic advantage, and I'll try to sum up here. We've got environmental and economic improvement as a result of natural gas, increased power generation dramatically. At the same time, methane emissions have fallen drastically. U.S. energy security, as a result of that, we've moved closer to energy independence. Not independent from oil, but independent from total energy. And if we had to, we could probably reduce the oil if there was an economic compelling advantage to do that. Natural gas liquids produced with the wet gas or rich gas are reliable chemical feedstocks, and you read about some of the cracker plants and so forth that are being developed in our neighborhood, and that'll generate other industries that will support those. That's huge. Most of that today is on the Gulf Coast, and that's expanding too, but we're seeing a resurgence of that right here. The U.S. chemical industry has been restored as a result of that. It's an inexpensive, environmentally friendly transportation fuel, although not widely used yet in this country. It is in places like India, China, third world areas, South America. It's the right fuel in the right place at the right time. Obviously, I'm biased, but these are generally supported facts. Natural gas helps us maintain our standard of living. It's a strong contributor to the economic recovery from 2008 forward. It contributes to economic well-being and growth. A lot of high-paying jobs, as I showed you. A lot of tax revenues, a lot of royalty payments to landowners. Reducing methane emissions is critical to sustainability and public acceptance of natural gas. So this is part of my message to our industry, is we've had great improvement here, and you know, we've kind of scratched the surface. We need to keep going on that. So it's a strategic advantage, and why it matters. Renewables are important, and we should be encouraging them, but they aren't the holy grail. That's a point I've tried to make. I'm not bashing renewables, I'm just saying from a practical point of view, we're a long way from that being the answer. So at least today and in the foreseeable future, they won't begin to handle all of our needs. They're 5 to 10% kind of impact on total energy. And they don't apply to all energy needs. For example, you know, there aren't many solar power airplanes. There was one. It took a person around the world over, I don't know how many weeks that took. There's poor storage technology. You know, big batteries and things like that are very expensive. The materials used for those are problematic environmentally and where they come from around the world. And so the renewable energy is intermittent, and it's not very productive in certain part of the countries. I mean, putting a solar plant in here where 300 days out of the year we got clouds, not very practical. Wind, maybe. Northwest Ohio, there's quite a few windmills. So it doesn't work everywhere, and it doesn't work all the time. So we have to have something to fill in the gaps. As I showed you with the, you know, what Germany has discovered, you got to have alternatives, and natural gas, for a lot of reasons that I've described, is the best alternative for that. And we got lots of it. And we're expected to meet the demands foreseeable future, probably the next 100 years, the next century. So we're in a great place. The message is this not screw it up, message to my industry and also to the general public. Don't be scared of it. Research the facts, form your own opinion. Don't listen to everything you hear on the news and what some of the activists are promoting. Here are some websites that you can go to and get lots of information. And the industry is getting a little better about putting out information that's useful and understandable. So I've used up all my time. I've got to leave pretty quick and go to the airport. Any quick questions? I could talk for 3 days about this.
Norm, that was wonderful. Thank you. I know you have to get to the airport, so I was worrying about it. Thank you very much. And if anybody wants to stay real quick, maybe they can ask you a quick question. Okay. June 8th is going to be our next one. Not the first Thursday, but the second Thursday. The Manufacturers Council is going to be putting a panel together to discuss how to find the right people to hire. and some of the things that are going on in the county that are assisting us in trying to find the right people. And by the right people, I mean trained, ready, soft skill development, drug-free, all those things. We're going to be talking about all those things, about finding the right people, and what the Manufacturers Council and many other people on that council are doing in the county to help the businesses find the right people to hire. So it's not the first Thursday, it's the second Thursday in June, which is the 8th. And I just want to thank Stratus Wealth Partners, Brent Markley, for sponsoring the recording and the rebroadcast of this event, and also to Buckeye Water Services for the pastries. Got to have that. So thank you, and we'll see you next month. Thanks, Norm.